All right. Hello, hello. I know there's technically no one on here yet, but for later on when I post this. Welcome everybody to another rendition of the reading of Wicked. I'm glad you could join me this evening. For any of you who may have accidentally stumbled upon this live, hi, my name is Mimi, and this is my very first uh, YouTube live. So it is nice to be here. Thanks for joining me. Um, for anyone who may not know, for anyone who is just joining, Miss Debbie, hi! I'm so happy to see you. Happy Monday. Um, so for anyone who may end up stumbling upon this recording later on, I am a transplant more or less from TikTok. And so a lot of my followers, I'm hoping, follows me here. Because we used to do Monday readings of books every Monday from like 8 to 9, 8 to 9:15 ish. Sometimes it depended on the book. But that is what I'm hoping to carry on over here into YouTube rather than uploading from TikTok, just directly reading for you guys here in YouTube Live. So, without further ado, we have gotten through 3 readings of Wicked so far. So if you happen to have missed any of those readings, do not panic. It is okay. You can always go back onto my channel, and in my playlist, my book readings playlist, I've got them already listed in order so you don't have to like skim through and guess which video you need to start watching. I've got them all listed for you. So far you've missed 3 readings. This will be our 4th one. But if you happen to have seen the Broadway show, if you happen to have seen the film already on at the theaters, this is the original Wicked story, based on the original Wizard of Oz series that this author expands upon the original world of the Wizard of Oz. So it's a bit darker, it's a bit more adult. So there's definitely a lot of really sensitive themes in this book. If you happen to have your kids with you, this is not like reading for a 6-year-old. It's not like, your grandma's version of The Wizard of Oz, to be sure. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead. Ishmael, hi! Ah! I'm so happy to see you. Oh my, what the hell sound was that? What sound did I just make? Anyway. But anyway, so let's go ahead. We'll go ahead and get started. And I'll read for about an hour, depending on, where the book takes us. But so far, just a real quick recap. We have been introduced to Elphaba. We have been introduced to Galinda. We have been introduced a little bit to the world of Oz. We have been given a bit of Elphaba's backstory. And so right now we find ourselves in Shiz University, like Galinda and Elphaba. They have gotten themselves to Shiz University. They have just met. They are roommates now. And so their story together is really starting to unfold. So, like I said, this is a darker version than probably what you're expecting from, like, based on the Broadway show, based on the original Wizard of Oz stuff. You've been warned. And if you've not seen the movie, if you've not seen the show, there's going to be spoilers in here. So you've been warned. And Basil, hello, how are you? Thanks for joining us this evening. All right. We are in chapter 3 of part 2 of this book. There's like 5 parts to this book, by the way. All right. One evening, the first evening of snow, Madame Morrible held a poetry soiree. Boys from Three Queens and Ozma Towers were invited. Galinda brought out her cherise satin gown with the matching shawl and slippers, and an heirloom Gillikinese fan, painted with a pattern of ferns and phoenix. She arrived early to lay claim to the upholstered chair that would best set off her own attire, and she dragged the chair over to the bookshelf so that the light from the library tapers would gently fall on her. The rest of the girls, not only the freshers, but the sophisters and seniors, entered in a whispering clot and arranged themselves on sofas and lounges in Crage Hall's nicest parlor. The boys who came were somewhat disappointing. There weren't that many, and they looked terrified or giggled with one another. Then the professors and doctors arrived, not just the animals from Crage Hall, but the boys' professors too, who were mostly men. The girls began to be glad that they had dressed well, for while the boys were a spotty bunch, the male professors had grave and charming smiles. Even some of the amas came, though they sat behind a screen at the back of the room. The sound of their knitting needles going at a rapid rate was soothing to Galinda somehow. She knew Amma Clutch would be there. The double doors at the end of the parlor were swept open by that little bronze industrial crab Galinda had met on her first evening at Crage Hall. It had been especially serviced for the occasion. You could still detect the cutting scent of metal polish. Madame Morrible then made an entrance, severe and striking in a coal-black cape, which she let drop to the floor. The thingy picked it up and slung it over a sofa back. Her gown was a fiery orange, with abalone lake shells stitched all over it. Despite herself, Galinda had to admire the effect. In tones even more unctuous than usual, Madame Morrible welcomed the visitors and led polite applause at the notion of poetry and its civilizing effects. Then she spoke on the new verse from sweeping the social parlors and poetry dens of Shiz. "It is known as the quell," said Madame Morrible, in her head mistress's smile displaying an impressive assembly of teeth. "The quell is a brief poem, uplifting in nature. It pairs a sequence of 13 short lines with a concluding, unrhyming apotheme. The reward of the poem is in the revealing contrast between rhyming argument and concluding remark. Sometimes they may contradict each other, but always they illuminate and, like all poetry, sanctify life." She beamed like a beacon in a fog. "Tonight especially, a quell might serve as an anodyne to the unpleasant disruptions we have been hearing about in our nation's capital." The boy students looked at least alert, and all the professors nodded, though Galinda could tell none of the girl students had a clue as to what unpleasant disruptions Madame Morrible was prattling on about. A third-year girl at the hammer-strung keyboard clattered out a couple of chords, and the guests cleared their throats and looked at their shoes. Galinda saw Elphaba arrive in the back of the room, dressed in her usual casual red shift, 2 books under her arm and a scarf wound around her head. She sank into the last empty chair and bit into an apple just as Madame Morrible was drawing in a dramatic breath to begin. "Sing a hymn to rectitude, ye forward-thinking multitude, advance in humble gratitude for strictest rules of attitude, to elevate the common good in brotherhood and sisterhood. We celebrate authority, fraternity, sorority. United, pressing onward we restrict the ills of liberty. There is no numinosity, like power's generosity, in helping curb atrocity. Bear down on the rod and foil the child." Madame Morrible lowered her head to signify that she was done. There was a rumbling of indistinct comments. Galinda, who didn't know much about poetry, thought perhaps this was the accepted way of appreciating it. She grumbled a little bit to Shen-Shen, who sat in a straight-backed chair on one side, looking dropsical. Wax from the taper was about to drip onto Shen-Shen's silk-shouldered white gown with the lemon chiffon swags, and ruin it most likely, but Galinda decided Shen-Shen's family could afford to replace a gown. She kept still. "Another," said Madame Morrible, "another quell." The room grew silent, but a little uneasily so. "Alas, for impropriety, the guillotine of piety! To remedy society, indulge not to satiety. In mirth and shameless gaiety, choose sobering sobriety. Behave as if the deity approaches in its mystery, and greet it with sonority. Let your especial history be built upon sorority, whose virtues do exemplify, and social good thus multiply. Animals should be seen and not heard." Thank you, Calvin Wilbur. I appreciate your compliment. Again, there was a mumbling, but it was of a different nature now, a meaner key. Dr. Dillamond harumphed and beat a cloven hoof against the floor, and was heard to say, "Well, that's not poetry, that's propaganda, and it's not even good propaganda at that." Elphaba sidled over to Galinda's side with her chair under her arm, and plunked it down between Galinda and Shen-Shen. She put her bony behind on its slatted seat, and leaned to Galinda and asked, "What do you make of this?" It was the first time Galinda had ever been addressed by Elphaba in public. Mortification bloomed. "I don't know," she said faintly, looking in the other direction. "It's a cleverness, isn't it?" said Elphaba. "I mean that last line. You couldn't tell by that fancy accent whether it was meant to be animals or animals. No wonder Dillamond's furious." And he was. Dr. Dillamond looked around the room as if trying to marshal the opposition. "I'm shocked, shocked," he said, "deeply shocked," he amended, and marched out of the room. Professor Lenx, the bore, who taught math, left too, accidentally crushing an antique gilded sideboard through trying to avoid stepping on Miss Milla's yellow-lace train. Mr. Miko, the ape, who taught history, sat dolefully in the shadows, too confused and ill at ease to make a move. "Well," said Madame Morrible in a carrying tone, "one expects poetry, if it is poetry, to offend. It is the right of art." "I think she's bonkers," said Elphaba. Galinda found it too horrible. What if even one of the pimply boys saw Elphaba whispering to her? She'd never hold her head up in society again. Her life was ruined. "Shh! I'm listening. I love poetry," Galinda told her sternly. "Don't talk to me. You're ruining my evening." Elphaba sat back and finished her apple, and they both kept listening. The grumbling and murmuring grew louder after each poem, and the boys and girls began to relax and look around at one another. When the last quell of the evening had knelled, to the cryptic aphorism, "A witch in time saves 9," Madame Morrible retired to uneven applause. She allowed her bronze servant to administer tea to the guests, and then the girls, and finally the Ammas. In a heap of rustling silk and clicking abalone lake shells, she received compliments from the male professors and some of the braver boys, and begged them to sit near her so she could enjoy their criticisms. "Do tell the truth. I was overly dramatic, wasn't I? It is my curse. The stage called, but I chose a life of service to girls." She lowered her eyelashes in modesty as her captive audience mumbled a lukewarm protest. Galinda was still trying to extricate herself from the embarrassing company of Elphaba, who kept on about the quells and what they meant, and if they were any good. "How do I know? How should I know? We're first-year girls, remember," said Galinda, yearning to swish over to where Fanny, Milla, and Shen-Shen were squeezing lemons into the teacups of a few edgy boys. "Well, your opinion is as good as hers, I think," said Elphaba. "That's the real power of art, I think, not to chide, but to provoke challenge. Otherwise, why bother?" A boy came up to them. Galinda thought he wasn't much to look at, but anything was better than the green leech at her side. "How do you do?" said Galinda, not even waiting for him to get up his nerve. "It's so nice to meet you. You must be from, let's see." "Well, I'm from Briscoe Hall, actually," he said, "but I'm a Munchkinlander originally, as you can tell." And she could, for he hardly came up to her shoulder. He wasn't bad looking for all that. A spun cotton mess of ill-combed golden hair, a toothy smile, a better complexion than some. The evening tunic he wore was a provincial blue, but there were flecks of silver thread running through it. He was trim, nicely so. His boots were polished, and he stood a little bandy-legged, feet pointed out. "This is what I love," said Galinda, "meeting strangers. This is shiz at its finest. I am Gillikanese." She just managed to keep herself from adding, "of course," for she believed it evident in her attire. Munchkinlander girls had a habit of quieter dress, so understated that they were often mistaken, in shiz, for servants. "Well, then, hello to you," said the boy. "My name is Master Bach. Miss Galinda of the Arduennes of the Uplands." "And you?" said Bach, turning to Elphaba. "Who are you?" "I'm leaving," she said. "Fresh dreams, all." "No, don't leave," said Bach. "I think I know you." "You don't know me," said Elphaba, pausing as she turned. "However could you know me?" "You're Miss Elfie, aren't you?" "Miss Elfie!" cried Galinda gaily. "How delightful!" "How do you know who I am?" said Elphaba. "Master Bach from Munchkinland. I don't know you." "You and I played together when you were tiny," said Bach. "My father was the mayor of the village you were born in, I think. You were born in Rush Margins, in Wen Harding's, weren't you? You're the daughter of the Unionist minister. I forget his name." "Frex," said Elphaba. Her eyes looked slanted and wary. "Frexbar the Godly," said Bach. "That's right. You know they still talk about him, and your mamma, and the night the clock of the Time Dragon came to Rush Margins. I was 2 or 3 years old, and they took me to see it, but I don't remember that. I do remember that you were in a play set with me when I was still in short pants. Do you remember Gaunette? She was the woman who minded us. And Buffy, he's my dad. Do you remember Rush Margins?" "This is all smoke and guesswork," said Elphaba. "How can I contradict? Let me tell you about what happened in your life before you can remember it. You were born a frog." This was unkind, as Bach did have an amphibious look about him. "You got sacrificed to the clock of the Time Dragon and returned into a boy. But on your marriage night, when your wife opens her legs, you'll turn back into a tadpole and—" "Miss Elphaba!" cried Galinda, flicking her open fan to wave the flush of shame from her face. "Your tongue!" "Oh, well, I have no childhood," said Elphaba. "You can say what you like. I grew up in Quadling country with the marsh people. I squelch when I walk. You don't want to talk to me. I talk to Miss Galinda. She's much better in parlors than I— Talk to Miss Galinda. She's much better in parlors than I am. I have to go now." Elphaba nodded a good-night salute and escaped, almost at a run. "Why did she say all that?" said Bach. No embarrassment in his voice, just wonder. "Of course I remember her. How many green people are there?" "It's just possible," considered Galinda, "that she didn't like being recognized on account of her skin color. I don't know for sure, but perhaps she's sensitive about it." "She must know that it's what people would remember." "Well, as far as I'm aware, you are right about who she is," Galinda went on. "They tell me her great-grandfather is the eminent Throp of Colwyn Grounds in Nest Hardings." "That's the one," Bach said. "Elfie. I never thought I'd see her again." "Won't you have some more tea? I'll call the server," Galinda said. "Let us sit here, and you can tell me about Munchkinland. I am a-quiver with curiosity." She perched herself back on the chair in sympathetic colors and looked her very best. Bach sat down, shook his head, and as if bewildered by the apparition of Elphaba. When Galinda retired that evening, Elphaba was already in bed, blankets pulled up over her head, and a patently theatrical snore issuing forth. Galinda huffed herself into bed with a whoomp, annoyed that she could feel rejected by the green girl. In the week that followed, much was said about the evening of quails. Dr. Dillamond interrupted his biology lecture to call for a response from his students. The girls didn't understand what a biological response to poetry might be, and sat silent at his leading questions. He finally exploded. Doesn't anyone make the connection between the expression of those thoughts and what's been going on in the Emerald City? Miss Fanny, who didn't believe she was paying tuition in order to be yelled at, snapped back at him. We don't have the tiniest notion what's going on in the Emerald City. Stop playing games with us. If you have something to say it. Don't bleat so. Dr. Dillamond stared out the windows and seemed to be trying to control his temper. The students were thrilled with the little drama. Then the goat turned, and in a milder voice than they expected, he told them that the Wizard of Oz had proclaimed bans on animal mobility, effective several weeks ago. This meant not only that animals were restricted in their access to travel conveyances, lodgings, and public services. The mobility it referred to was also professional. Any animal coming of age was prohibited from working in the professions or the public sector. They were effectively to be herded back to the farmlands and wilds if they wanted to work for wages at all. What do you think Madame Morrible was saying when she ended that quell with the epigram, "Animals should be seen and not heard"? Asked the goat tersely. Well, anyone would be upset, said Galinda. I mean, any animal. But it's not as if your job is threatened, is it? You are still teaching us. What about my children? What about my kids? Do you have kids? I didn't know you were married. The goat closed his eyes. I'm not married, Miss Galinda, but I might be, or I may. Or perhaps I have nieces and nephews. They have already been banned effectively from studying at Shiz because they can't hold a pencil to write an essay with. How many animals have you ever seen in this paradise of education? Well, it was true. There were none. Well, I do think it's pretty dreadful, said Galinda. Why would the Wizard of Oz do such a thing? Why, indeed, said the goat. No, really, why? It's a real question. I don't know. I don't know either. The goat turned to his rostrum and shoved some papers this way and that, and was then seen pawing a handkerchief from a lower shelf and blowing his nose. My grandmothers were milking goats at a farm in Gillikin. Through their lifelong sacrifices and labors, they purchased the help of a local school teacher to educate me and to take dictation when I went for my exams. Their efforts are about to go to waste. But you can still teach, said Fanny petulantly. The thin edge of the wedge, my dear, said the goat, and dismissed the class early. Galinda found herself glancing over toward Elphaba, who had a strange, focused look. As Galinda fled the classroom, Elphaba approached the front of the room, where Dr. Dillamond stood shaking in uncontrolled spasms, his horned head bowed. A few days later, Madame Morrible gave one of her occasional open lectures on early hymns and pagan paeans. She called for questions, and the entire assembly was startled to see Elphaba unfold herself from her customary fetal position in the back of the room and address the head. Madame Morrible, if you please, said Elphaba, we never had an opportunity to discuss the quells that you recited in the parlor last week. Discuss, said Madame Morrible with a generous though shooing wave of the bangled hands. Well, Dr. Dillamond seemed to think they were in questionable taste, given the bans on animal mobility. Dr. Dillamond, alas, said Madame Morrible, is a doctor. He is not a poet. He is also a goat, and I might ask you girls if we have ever had a great goat sonneteer or balladeer. Alas, dear Miss Elphaba, Dr. Dillamond doesn't understand the poetic convention of irony. Would you like to define irony for the class, please? I don't believe I can, madam. Irony, some say, is the art of juxtaposing incongruous parts. One needs a knowing distance. Irony presupposes detachment, which, alas, in the case of animal rights, we may forgive Dr. Dillamond for being without. So that phrase that he objected to, animals should be seen and not heard, that was ironic? Continued Elphaba, studying her papers and not looking at Madame Morrible. Galinda and her classmates were enthralled, for it was clear that each of the females at opposite ends of the room would have enjoyed seeing the other crumple in a sudden attack of the spleen. One could consider it in an ironic mode if one chose, said Madame Morrible. How do you choose? Said Elphaba. How impertinent, said Madame Morrible. Well, I don't mean impertinence. I'm trying to learn. If you, if anyone, thought that statement was true, then it isn't in conflict with the boring bossy bit that preceded it. It's just argument and conclusion, and I don't see the irony. You don't see much, Miss Elphaba, said Madame Morrible. You must learn to put yourself in the shoes of someone wiser than you are, and look from that angle. To be stuck in ignorance, to be circumscribed by the walls of one's own modest acumen, well, it is very sad in one so young and bright. She spit out the last word, and it seemed to Galinda, somehow, a low comment on Elphaba's skin color, which today was indeed lustrous with the effort of public speaking. But I was trying to put myself in the shoes of Dr. Dillamond, said Elphaba, almost whining, but not giving up. In the case of poetic interpretation, I venture to suggest it may indeed be true. Animals should not be heard, snapped Madame Morrible. Do you mean that ironically? Said Elphaba, but she sat down with her hands over her face and did not look up again for the rest of the session. Chapter 4. Come here. Final chapter of this section. When the second semester began, and Galinda was still saddled with Elphaba as a roomie, she made a brief protest to Madame Morrible, but the head would allow no shifting, no rearranging. Far too upsetting for my other girls, she said, unless you'd like to be removed to the pink dormitory. Your Alma Clutch seems, to my watchful eye, to be recovering from the ailments you described when we first met. Perhaps now she is up to overseeing 15 girls? No, no, said Galinda quickly. There are recurrences from time to time, but I don't mention them. I don't like to be a bother. How thoughtful, said Madame Morrible. Bless you, sweet thing. Now, my dear, I wonder if we might take a moment, as long as you've come in for a chat, to discuss your academic plans for next fall. As you know, second year is when girls choose their specialties. Have you given it any thought? Very little, said Galinda. Frankly, I thought my talents would just emerge and make it clear whether I should try natural science, or the arts, or sorcery, or perhaps even history. I don't think I'm cut out for ministerial work. I'm not surprised that one such as you should be in doubt, said Madame Morrible, which wasn't greatly encouraging to Galinda. But may I suggest sorcery? You could be very good at it. I pride myself on knowing this sort of thing. I'll think about it, said Galinda, though her early appetite for sorcery had waned once she'd heard what a grind it was to learn spells, and, worse, to understand them. In the event you choose sorcery, it might, just might, be possible to find for you a new roomie, said Madame Morrible, given that Miss Elphaba has already told me her interests lie in the natural sciences. Oh, well then, I certainly will give it a great deal of thought, said Galinda. She struggled with unnamed conflicts within her. Madame Morrible, for all her upper-class diction and fabulous wardrobe, just seemed a tad, dangerous. As if her big public smile were composed of the light glancing off knives and lances, as if her deep voice masked the rumbling of distant explosions. Galinda always felt as if she couldn't see the whole picture. It was disconcerting, and to her credit at least Galinda felt inside herself the ripping apart of some valuable fabric. Was it integrity? When she sat in Madame Morrible's parlor and drank the perfect tea. For the sister, I hear, is eventually coming up to shiz, concluded Madame Morrible after a few minutes later, as if silence had not intervened, and several tasty biscuits. Because there's nothing I can do to stop it, and that, I understand, would be dreadful. You would not like it. The sister, being as she is, undoubtedly spending much time in Miss Elphaba's room, being tended to. She smiled wanly. A puff of powdery aroma came forward from the flank of her neck, almost as if Madame Morrible could somehow dispense a pleasant personal odor at will. The sister being as she is, Madame Morrible tutted and wagged her head back and forth as she saw Galinda to the door. Miserable, really, but I suppose we shall all pull together and cope. That is sorority, isn't it? The head grasped her shawl and put a gentle hand on Galinda's shoulder. Galinda shivered, and was sure Madame Morrible felt it, knew it, but the head never registered a sign of it. But then, my use of sorority. How ironic. Too witty. Given a long enough time, of course, a wide enough frame, there is nothing said or done, ever, that isn't ironic in the end. She squeezed Galinda's shoulder blade as if it were a bicycle handle, almost harder than was proper for a woman to do. We can only hope, ha, that the sister comes with some veils of her own, but that's a year yet. Meanwhile we have time. Think about sorcery, would you? Do. Now good-bye, my pet, and fresh dreams. Galinda walked back to her room slowly, wondering what Elphaba's sister was like to provoke those catty remarks about veils. She wanted to ask Elphaba, but she couldn't think of how to do it. She didn't have the nerve. Excuse me. Bock. Chapter 1. Come on out, said the boys. Come out. They were leaning in the archway to Bock's room, a pell-mell clot of them, backlit by the oil lamp in the study beyond. We're sick of books. Come with us. Can't, said Bock. I'm behind in irrigation theory. Fuck your irrigation theory when the pubs are open, said the strapping Gillikinese bucko named Averick. You're not going to improve your grades at this late date, with the exams almost over and the examiners half crocked themselves. It's not the grades, said Bock. I just don't understand it yet. We're off to the pub. We're off to the pub, chanted some boys who, it seemed, had gotten a head start. Fuck Bock, the ale is waiting, and it's already aged enough. Which pub, then? Maybe I'll join you in an hour, Bock said, sitting firmly back in his chair and not lifting his feet to the footstool, as he knew that this might incite his classmates to hoist him to their shoulders and carry him off with them for an evening of debauchery. His smallness seemed to inspire such banditry. Feet square on the floor made him look more planted, he figured. The Boar and Fennel, said Averick. They've got a new witch performing. They say she's hot. She's a Cumbric witch. Huh, said Bock, unconvinced. Well, go on and get a good view. I'll come along when I can. The boys rambled away, rattling doors of other friends, knocking aslant the portraits of old boys now grown into august patrons. Averick stood in the archway and waited a minute longer. We might ditch some of the boars and take a select few of us off to the philosophy club, he said enticingly. Later on, I mean. It's the weekend, after all. Oh, Averick, go take a cold shower, said Bock. You admitted you were curious. You did. So why not an end-of-semester treat? I'm sorry I ever said I was curious. I'm curious about death, too, but I can wait to find out, thank you. Get lost, Averick. Better go catch up with your friends. Enjoy the Cumbric antics, which, by the way, I expect is false advertising. Cumbric witch talents went out hundreds of years ago, if indeed they ever existed. Averick turned up the second collar of his tunic jacket. The inside was lined with a deep red velvet plush. Against his elegant shaven neck, the lining seemed like a single ribbon of privilege. Bock found himself, once again, making mental comparisons between himself and handsome Averick, and coming up short. What, Averick? He said, as impatient with himself as he was with his friend. Something has happened to you, said Averick. I'm not that dull. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, said Bok. Tell me to mind my own business. Tell me to go fuck myself, to piss off. Go on, say it. But don't tell me nothing's wrong, for you're not that good a liar, and I'm not that stupid, even for a dissipated Gillicanese of decaying nobility. His expression was soft, and Bok momentarily was tempted. His mouth opened as if he thought of what to say, but at the sound of bells in Ozma Towers chiming the hour, Averick's head turned just a fraction. For all his concern, Averick wasn't entirely here. Bok closed his mouth, thought some more, and said, Call it Munchkin Lander stolidity. I won't lie, Averick. You're too good a friend to lie to. But there's nothing to say now. Go on and enjoy yourself, but be careful. He was about to add a word of warning against the Philosophy Club, but checked it. If Averick was annoyed enough, then Bok's nannyish worrying might backfire and goad Averick into going there. Averick came forward and kissed him on both cheeks and on the forehead, an upper-class northern custom that always made Bok profoundly ill at ease. Then, with a wink and a dirty gesture, he disappeared. Bok's room looked out over a cobblestoned alley, down which Averick and his cronies were swooping and weaving. Bok stood back, in the shadows, but needn't have worried. His friends weren't thinking of him now. They had made it through the halfway point in their exams and had a breather for a couple of days. After the exams, the campus would lie vacant except for the more befuddled of professors and the poorer of the boys. Bok had lived through this before. He preferred study, however, to scrubbing old manuscripts with a five-haired tech fur brush, which was what he would be employed to do in the Three Queens Library all summer long. Across the alley ran the bluestone wall of a private stable, attached to some mansion house a few streets away on a fashionable square. Beyond the stable roof you could see the rounded tops of a few fruit trees, in the kitchen garden of Crage Hall, and above them glowed the lancet windows of the dormitories and classrooms, where the girls forgot to draw their drapes, which was astoundingly often. You could see them in various stages of undress. Never the whole body naked, of course. In that case he would have looked away, or told himself sternly that he had better. But the pinkness and whiteness of underskirts and camisoles, the frilliness of foundation garments, the rustle about the bustle and the fuss about the bust, it was an education in lingerie, if nothing else. Bok, who had no sisters, merely looked. The Crage Hall dormitory was just far enough away that he couldn't make out the individual girls, and Bok was flushed with desire to see his heart throb again. Damn! Double damn! He couldn't concentrate. He'd be sent down if he queered his exams. He'd let down his father, old Buffy, and his village, and the other villages. Hell and hell. Life was hard, and Barley just and Barley? Yes, life was hard, and barley just wasn't enough. Bok found himself suddenly leaping over the footstool, grabbing his student cape, charging down the corridors, and plummeting around the stone spiral stairs in the corner tower. He couldn't wait any more. He had to do something, and an idea had come to him. He nodded to the porter on duty, turned left at the gate, and hurried along the road, in the dusk avoiding as best he could the generous heaps of horse manure. At least, with his classmates off gallivanting, he could make no fool of himself in their line of vision. There wasn't a soul left in Briscoe. So he turned left, then left again, and soon was pacing the alley at the stable. A rick of cordwood, the protruding edge of a swollen shutter, the iron bracket of a hoist. Bok was small, but he was nimble too, and with hardly a scrape of his knuckles he had swung himself to the tin gutter of the stable, and then was scrabbling like a lake crab up the steeply pitched roof. Aha! He might have thought of this weeks ago, months ago. But the night that all the boys would be out celebrating, the night he could be sure he himself wouldn't be seen from Briscoe Hall, that was tonight, and maybe only tonight. Some fate had insisted he resist Averick's invitation out, for now he was mounted on the stable roof, and the wind coursing through the wet leaves of the crawberry and pear trees made a soft fanfare, and there proceeded the girls into their hall, as if they'd been waiting in the corridor until he was properly positioned, as if they'd known he was coming. Closer up, they were not, on the whole, as pretty. But where was the one? And, pretty or not, they were clear. The fingers they dove into clumps of satin bow to untie them, the fingers they peeled gloves off with, and worked cunning rows of 40 miniature pearl buttons with, the fingers they loaned to each other, at the inside laces and the private places that college boys knew only by mythology. The unexpected tufts of hair, how tender, how marvelously animal-like. His hands clenched and unclenched themselves of their own accord, but hungry for what, he hardly knew. And where was she? "What the hell are you doing up here?" So he slipped, of course, because he was startled, and because fate, having been so kind as to award him this ecstasy, retributively was going to kill him now. He lost his footing and grabbed for the chimney, but missed. Head over thighs he rolled out like a child's toy, smashed into the poking branches of the damn pear tree, which probably saved his life, breaking his fall. He landed with a thud on a bed of lettuces, and the wind was loudly knocked out of him, mortifyingly so, through all available orifices. "Oh, brilliant," said the voice. "The trees are dropping their fruits early this year." He had a last lost hope that the person speaking would be his love. He tried to look urbane, though his spectacles had bounced somewhere. "How do you do?" he said uncertainly, sitting up. "This isn't how I intended to arrive." Barefoot and aproned, she came out from behind an arbor of pink Pertha grapes. It wasn't she. It wasn't the one. It was the other one. He could tell even without his glasses. "Oh, it's you," he said, trying not to sound devastated. She had a colander with baby grapes in it, the sour ones used in spring salads. "Oh, it's you," she said, coming closer. "I know you. Master Bach, at your service." "You mean Master Bach in my lettuces?" She picked up his spectacles from the runner beans and handed them back. "How are you, Miss Elfie?" "I'm not as tart as a grape, and not as squished as a lettuce," she said. "How are you, Master Bach?" "I am," he said, "considerably embarrassed. Am I going to get in trouble here?" "I can arrange it, if you like." "Don't go to the effort. I'll let myself out the way I came in." He looked up at the pear tree. "Poor thing, I've splintered some good-sized limbs." "Pity the poor tree. Why would you do that to it?" "Well, I was startled," he said, "and I had a choice. Either flip myself like a wood nymph through the leaves, or else just climb quietly down on the other side of the stable, into the street, and go back to my life. Which would you choose?" "Ah, that's the question," she said, "but I've always learned that the first thing to do is deny the question's validity. Myself, being startled, I would neither climb quietly streetward, nor would I trip noisily treeward and lettuce-bound. I would turn myself inside out and make myself lighter. I would hover until the air pressure outside me had stabilized. Then I would let the underside of my skin settle, one toe at a time, back on the roof." "And would you then reverse your skin?" he said, entertained. "Depends on who was standing there and what they wanted, and whether I minded. Also depends on what color the underside of my skin turns out to be. Never having reversed myself, you know, I can't be sure. I always thought it might be horrid to be pink and white like a piglet." "It often is," said Bach, "especially in the shower. You feel like an underdone—" But he stopped. The nonsense was becoming too personal. "I do beg your pardon," he said. "I startled you, and I didn't mean to." "You were looking at the tops of the fruit trees, examining the new growth, I assume?" she said, amused. "Indeed," he answered coldly. Did you see the tree of your dreams? The tree of my dreams is of my dreams, and I don't speak of that to my friends nor to you, whom I hardly know. Oh, but you know me. We were in a child playset together. You reminded me when we met last year. Why, we're nearly brother and sister. You can certainly describe your favorite tree to me, and I'll tell you if I know where she grows. You mock me, Miss Elfie. Well, that I don't mean to do, Buck. She used his name without the honorific, in a gentle way, as if to underscore her comment about their being like siblings. I suspect you want to know about Miss Galinda, the Gillicknese girl you met at Madame Morrible's poetry slaughter last autumn. Perhaps you do know me better than I thought. He sighed. Could I hope she thinks of me? Well, you could hope, said Elphaba. It would be more efficient to ask her and have done with it. At least you'd know. But you're a friend of hers, aren't you? Don't you know? You don't want to rely on what I know or not, said Elphaba, or what I say I know. I could be lying. I could be in love with you and betray my roomie by lying about her. She's your roomie? You're very surprised at that? Well, no, just just pleased. The cooks will be wondering what dialogues with the asparagus I'm having now, Elphaba said. I could arrange to bring Miss Galinda here some evening if you like, sooner rather than later, so as to kill your joy the more neatly and entirely. If that is what's to happen, she said. But as I say, how do I know? If I can't predict what we'll have for pudding, how can I predict someone's affections? They set a date for 3 nights hence, and Bok thanked Elphaba fervently, shaking her hand so hard his spectacles jounced on his nose. You're a dear old friend, Elfie, even if I haven't seen you in 15 years, he said, giving her back her name without its honorific. She withdrew beneath the boughs of the pear trees and disappeared down the walkway. Bok found his way out of the kitchen garden and back to his room, and reviewed his books again. But the problem wasn't solved. No, not solved. It was exacerbated. He couldn't concentrate. He was still awake to hear the noisy clatterings, the hushings, the crashings, and the muttered balladeerings when the drunken boys returned to Briscoe Hall. I believe we'll have time for one more chapter this evening. Chapter 2. Avaric had left for the summer, once the exams were done, and Bok either had flim-flammed his way through or disgraced himself, in which case there was little to lose now. This first rendezvous with Galinda might be the last. Bok bothered with his clothes more than usual, and got an opinion on how to fix his hair from the new look in the cafes. A thin white ribbon around the crown of his head, pulling his hair straight from the nub, so that it burst into curls beneath, like froth exploding from an overturned basin of milk. He cleaned his boots several times over. It was too warm for boots, but he had no evening slippers. Make do, make do. On the appointed evening he retraced his way, and, on the stable roof, found that a fruit-picker's ladder had been left leaning up against the wall, so he need not descend through the leaves like a vertiginous chimpanzee. He picked his way carefully down the first few rungs, then jumped manfully the rest of the way, avoiding the lettuces this time. On a bench under the worm-nut trees sat Elphaba, her knees drawn casually up to her chest, and her bare feet flat on the seat of the bench, and Galinda, whose ankles were crossed daintily, and who hid behind a satin fan, and who was looking in the other direction anyway. Well, my stars and garters, a visitor, said Elphaba. Such a surprise! Good evening, ladies, he said. Your head looks like a hedgehog in shock. What did you do to yourself? Said Elphaba. At least Galinda turned to see, but then she disappeared behind the fan again. Could she be so nervous? Could her heart be faint? Well, I am part hedgehog, didn't I tell you? Said Bock. On my grandfather's side. He ended up as cutlets for Ozma's retinue one hunting season, and a tasty memory for all. The recipe is handed down in the family, pasted into the picture album, served with cheese and walnut sauce. Mmm. Are you really? Said Elphaba. She put her chin on her knees. Really, Hedgehog? No, it was a fancy. Good evening, Miss Galinda. It was good of you to agree to meet me again. This is highly improper, said Galinda, for a number of reasons, as you well know, Master Bock. But my roomie would give me no rest until I said yes. I can't say that I am pleased to see you again. Oh, say it, maybe it'll be true, said Elphaba. Try it out. He's not so bad for a poor boy. I am pleased that you are so taken with me, Master Bock, said Miss Galinda, working a curtsy. I am flattered. She clearly was not flattered, she was humiliated. But you must see that there can be no special friendship between us. Apart from the matter of my feelings, there are too many social impediments for us to proceed. I only agreed to come so that I could tell you this in person. It seemed only fair. It seemed only fair, and it might be fun, too, said Elphaba. That's why I'm hanging around. Excuse me. There's the issue of different cultures to start, said Galinda. I know you are a Munchkinlander. I am a Gillikanese. I will need to marry one of my own. It is the only way. I'm sorry. She lowered her fan and lifted her hand, palm out, to stop his protest. And furthermore, you are a farmer from the agricultural school, and I require a statesman or a banker from Ozma Towers. This is just how things are. Besides, said Galinda, you're too short. What about his subversion of custom by coming here this way? What about his silliness? Said Elphaba. Enough, said Galinda. That'll do, Miss Elphaba. Please, you're too certain of yourself, said Bock. If I may be so bold. You're not so bold at all, said Elphaba. You're about as bold as tea made from used leaves. You're embarrassing me with hanging back so. Come on, say something interesting. I'm starting to wish I'd gone to chapel. You're interrupting, said Bock. Miss Elfie, you've done a wonderful thing to encourage Miss Galinda to meet me, but I must ask you to leave us alone to sort things out. Neither of you will understand what the other is saying, said Elphaba calmly. I'm a Munchkinlander by birth anyway, if not by upbringing, and I'm a girl by accident, if not by choice. I am the natural arbiter between you two. I don't believe you can get along without me. In fact, if I leave the garden, you'll cease to decipher each other's language entirely. She speaks the tongue of rich, and you speak clotted poor. Besides, I paid for this show by wheedling Miss Galinda for 3 days running. I get to watch. It would be so good of you to stay, Miss Elphaba, said Galinda. I require a chaperone when with a boy. You see what I mean, Elphaba said to Bock. Then if you must stay, at least let me talk, Bock said. Please let me speak, just for a few minutes. Miss Galinda, what you say is true. You are high-born, and I am common. You are Gillikanese, and I Munchkinlander. You have a social pattern to conform to, and so do I. And mine doesn't include marrying a girl too wealthy, too foreign, too expectant. Marriage isn't what I came here to propose. See, I'm glad I didn't leave. This is just getting good, said Elphaba, but clamped her lips shut when they both glared at her. I came here to propose that we meet from time to time. That's all, said Bock, that we meet as friends. That, free of expectations, we come to know each other as dear friends. I do not deny that you overwhelm me with your beauty. You are the moon in the season of shadow light. You are the fruit of the candlewood tree. You are the phoenix in circles of flight. This sounds rehearsed, said Elphaba. You are the mythical sea, he concluded. All his eggs in one basket. I'm not much for poetry, said Galinda, but you're very kind. She had seemed to perk up a little at the compliments. Anyway, the fan was moving faster. I don't really understand the point of friendship, as you call it, Master Bach, between unmarried people of our age. It seems distracting. I can see it might lead to complications, especially as you confess to an infatuation I cannot hope to return. Not in a million years. It's the age of daring, said Bach. It's the only time we have. We must live in the present. We are young and alive. I don't know if alive quite covers it, said Elphaba. This sounds scripted to me. Galinda rapped Elphaba on the head with her fan, which folded smartly up and opened just as neatly again, an elegant, practiced gesture that impressed all of them. You're being tiresome, Miss Elfie. I appreciate your company, but I didn't request a running commentary. I'm perfectly capable of deciding the merits of Master Bach's recital myself. Let me consider his stupid idea. Lurline above, I can hardly hear myself think. Losing her temper, Galinda was prettier than ever. So that old saw was true, too. Bach was learning so much about girls. Her fan was dropping. Was that a good sign? If she hadn't had some affection for him, would she have worn a dress with a neckline that dipped just a tad lower than he had dared hope? And there was the essence of rose water on her. He felt a surge of possibility, an inclination to rub his lips on the place where her shoulder became her neck. Your merits, she was saying. Well, you're brave, I suppose, and clever, to have figured this out. If Madame Morrible ever found you here, we'd be in severe trouble. Of course, you might not know that, so scratch the bravery part. Just clever. You're clever and you're sort of... Oh, well, I mean, to look at. Handsome? Suggested Elphaba. Dashing? You're fun to look at, decided Galinda. Bach's face fell. Fun? He said. I'd give a lot to achieve fun, said Elphaba. The best I usually hope for is stirring. And when people say that they're usually referring to digestion. Well, I might be all or none of the things you say, said Bach staunchly, but you will learn that I am persistent. I will not let you say no to our friendship, Galinda. It means too much to me. Behold the male beast roaring in the jungle for his mate, said Elphaba. See how the female beast giggles behind a shrub while she organizes her face to say, Pardon, dear, did you say something? Elphaba! They both cried at her. My word, Ducky, said a voice behind them, and all three turned. It was some middle-aged minder in a striped apron, her thinning gray hair twisted in a knot on her head. What are you getting yourself up to? I'm a clutch, Galinda said. How did you think to look for me here? That zebra cook told me some yakky was going on out here. You think they're blind in there? Now who is this? This don't look good at all, not to me. Bach stood. I am Master Bach of Rush Margins, Munchkinland. I am nearly a third-year fellow at Briscoe Hall. Elphaba yawned. Is this show over? Well, I am shocked. A guest don't get shown into the vegetable garden, so I guess you arrived uninvited. Sir, get yourself gone from here before I be calling the porters to remove you. Oh, Alma Clutch, don't make a scene, said Galinda, sighing. He's hardly developed enough to worry about, pointed out Elphaba. Look, he's still beardless, and from what we can deduce, Bach said in a rush, perhaps this is all wrong. I did not come here to be abused. Forgive me, Miss Galinda, if I have failed even to amuse you. As for you, Miss Elphaba, his voice was as cold as he could make it, and that was colder than he'd ever heard it himself. I was wrong to have trusted in your compassion. Wait and see, said Elphaba. Wrong takes an awful long time to be proven, in my experience. Meanwhile, why don't you come back sometime? There is no second time to this, said Alma Clutch, tugging at Galinda, who was proving as sedentary as set cement. Miss Elphaba, Shame on you for encouraging this scandal. Nothing here has been perpetuated but badinage, and bad badinage at that, said Elphaba. Miss Galinda, you're mighty stubborn there. You're planting yourself in the vegetable garden for good in the hopes that this boy visitation might occur again. Have we misread your interest? Galinda stood at last with some dignity. My dear Master Bach, she said, as if dictating, it was ever my intention to dissuade you from pursuing me, in romantic attachment or even in friendship, as you put it. I had not meant to bruise you. It is not my nature. At this, Elphaba rolled her eyes, but for once kept her mouth shut, perhaps because Amma Clutch had dug her fingernails into Elphaba's elbow. I will not deign to arrange another meeting like this. As Amma Clutch reminds me, it is beneath me. Amma Clutch hadn't exactly said that, but even so she nodded grimly. But if our paths cross in a legitimate way, Master Bach, I will do you the courtesy, at least, of not ignoring you. I trust you will be satisfied with that. Never, said Bach with a smile, but it's a start. And now good evening, said Amma Clutch on behalf of them all, and steered the girls away. Fresh dreams, Master Bach, and don't come back. Miss Elfie, you were horrible, he heard Galinda say, while Elphaba twisted round and waved goodbye, with a grin he could not clearly read. Ah, good Lord. Well, that was a lot of excitement for one reading. All right. Well, that concludes this week's read. Thank you all so very much for joining me. Kind of like what I did on TikTok, I'm going to try and make these reads weekly, and they're most likely going to be done on Monday evenings from 8 to 9, 8 to sometimes 9:15 Eastern Standard Time, depending on the chapters, depending on me, whatever. But yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed this read so far. I know I have. I have loved reading this story and getting all of the back details that you don't really get like in the show, that you don't get in the movie. Having these characters fleshed out so much more is such a joy for me. I love everything about this. So until next week, guys, I hope you all take care of yourselves, stay safe, stay hydrated, and I will see you all next Monday. Bye. Oh, good. I'm glad Holly liked it, Ishmael. Tell her I said hello. Tell the kids I said hi. I'll see you guys next week.